It all started when I was 8 years old. Before that, I had a pretty normal life. My mom worked at home, and my dad worked at an office. They both loved my older brother and me very much. I looked up to my family as the perfect family. Two loving parents and a brother who was annoying at times, but still loved me very much. When I turned 8, my dad started acting a little bit weird and returning home an hour late or so. I was still very young, so I just thought he had a lot of work and couldn't make it home in time, and my mother trusted him completely, so she didn't think anything of it either. But when I turned 9, my parents decided my brother was old enough to go to England and learn some English. My mom was very considering, and all the money she made was for my brother and me. That year, my father continued arriving late too, but this time, instead of arriving at 9 or 10 p.m., he arrived at 2 or 3 a.m. I wasn't really aware of what was happening, and my mother was starting to worry a lot. She thought he was depressed or something, so she did everything in her power to help him, taking him to psychologists, therapy, etc. We even got a dog because my mother read that dogs were very effective and were great support for people with depression and stress. I was also starting to get very worried about him, and it started affecting my grades and the way I acted in school. One day, I came back from school to see my mother sitting down in the living room, crying with her phone on her hand, unable to breathe. Of course, I got very worried and ran up to her to see if she was okay. She started crying uncontrollably, saying that we had been hacked and that someone had stolen all of our money. I sat with her, which felt like forever, and telling her to calm down. You see, my mother was this strong, caring woman, and I had never seen her cry like that. So eventually, I started silently crying too. When she calmed down, she explained to me that when my brother was born, she created a bank account to save money for my brothers and my future. She saved 25,000 euros, and now there was only 3,000 euros left. I told her to check who took it. I think my mom deep down knew who it was, but she was way too scared to admit it. It was my dad who took it. I was as surprised as she was, because although I could tell she knew she wished it wasn't him, I was young and naive, so I reassured her that he probably needed the money for something, but he was too scared to ask. When he arrived home, my heart dropped. I was so scared, and suddenly a wave of questions popped up in my head. Are they going to get divorced? What is going to happen? Why did my dad take the money? My mother asked me to go to my room, so I just threw myself in bed and started crying. My parents couldn't hear me because they were shouting a lot. But that night I didn't eat dinner and just cried myself to sleep. The next morning I got woken up at 5 a.m. by someone's footsteps. I decided to get out of bed and see what was going on. The living room's light was on and the doors were closed, but I could hear my mom and my dad talking. I heard my mom say, "So, you've been sleeping with other women," in a sad tone of voice, in which my father didn't reply. I was so surprised. Maybe I heard wrong. Maybe it wasn't true. At least, I wished it wasn't. My mom continued saying, "Anyways, we aren't going to mention any of this to our daughter, and I don't want you to be sad around her, so put on a brave face." I was very surprised, so I just went to bed until it was time for me to wake up to go to school. I don't remember anything that happened that breakfast. The only thing I can remember is that underneath their happy faces, there was misery and devastation. I didn't ask any questions, but when my dad was taking me to school that day, he broke down and started silently crying. I just gave him a hug and told him that everything was going to be okay. The only thing my parents asked me to do was not to mention any of this to my brother, as he was already going through a lot of stuff in England. The inability to not speak to anyone about this made me miserable. I didn't have many friends, and the only friends I had weren't very close. I did try to speak to them about it, but it was too much, and they didn't even know how to treat a girl with such problems. So eventually, they stopped talking to me. It was very sad at this point. People made fun of me at school, and I didn't want to tell my mom because I knew she would get very worried. My parents continued being friendly, and my dad stayed home with us until he could find a new place to live. But because my brother didn't know about any of this, my dad had to come back home when my brother visited. They didn't sleep in the same bed, so my brother could tell that something was going on, but he didn't say anything. On July that year, they got divorced, and they agreed that my mother would have full custody, but my father could come visit whenever he asked. At that point, everything was going so bad, I often thought about ending my life. Sometimes when I called him to go for a walk, he would agree, but never show up. Also, whenever we came to his house for the weekend, he was always tired and sleepy. This was a very weird behavior. The following year, my mother decided that wasn't an environment for a 10-year-old to be in, so she sent me to England. I soon learned that my mother was paying for everything, which included our clothes, food, schools, etc. I am very grateful to my mom because my brother and I had everything we needed and wanted. When I came to visit them, I saw that my brother was very mean to my mom and always shouted at her. He was having a lot of problems focusing at school too. My mom took us to a psychologist who diagnosed me with anxiety. My mom found a very good psychiatrist, and I saw her every time I came back home. That year, things continued the same. One day, my mother asked us both to sit down because she had something to tell us. She told us that my father was an addict. She knew before he stole the money, and told us that he consumed it in clubs with prostitutes. I was so disappointed in my dad. How could he cheat on my mom when she cared about him so much? I admired my father a lot, but that day I lost all respect for him. My mother continued telling us that we couldn't tell my father that we knew because they planned on telling us when we were older. I am back home now, and my dad hasn't told us yet, but he tells us that he volunteers at an organization for addicts like him. He told me that working with these people, he has realized that addiction is a disease and that only a few people make it through. 2 years ago, I didn't care what happened to him because I thought he deserved it. But now I know that it was very hard for him, and I am very proud of him because he is trying so hard to do better. It's been 3 years, and my father has recovered. He is paying for our things and also giving back the money he owed to my mom. I can't look at him the same way, but I know he is doing a lot better, and hopefully I'll find a way to fully forgive him for what he did. But I'm very glad he's doing better. It was very stressful for me to see my parents fight all the time, but my anxiety has gotten better. I've made many new friends, but I have a lot of trust issues, so I don't think I will ever tell them this story. I also admire my mom a lot for the way she handled things and how she wanted to protect me and my brother at all costs. She is the strongest woman I know, and her and my dad are trying to get along for me and my brother.